So here we are again in Latvia. All of these lectures will be coming from Latvia. I don't know why I insist on saying here we are again in Latvia. I guess maybe I love coming to this part of the world, so maybe that's why I talk about it all the time. You can see that I obviously have my scarf on. It's not just because I'm wanting to look cool, and as predicted with the last video, it is indeed snowing again. So how about that? In any event, the New Testament shares some of the same kinds of ideas that we find in the Old Testament. I mentioned a text from Deuteronomy, a text from Isaiah, a couple of texts from Isaiah, a couple of texts from Amos. What about the New Testament? Jesus himself thinks about the poor in a way that is very consistent with the Hebrew prophets. In fact, one of the texts that's probably one of the more famous ones from Jesus is the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. And Jesus starts that sermon, the so-called sermon, starts that with what are called the Beatitudes. Blessed are this, blessed are that, blessed are the other thing, right? So it starts with blessed are those who are poor in spirit. Now, interestingly, Luke says blessed are the poor. And so we could spend some time playing with that a little bit, but let's just stick with Matthew for a moment, because Jesus says something in Matthew chapter 5 verse 6 that I think needs to be just dredged up here a little bit. So Matthew chapter 5 verse 6, Jesus says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. That is very often the way it's translated. But interestingly enough, in Greek, the word righteousness and the word justice are the same exact word. And part of what's going on in Matthew is the writer is making a case for why the church community should be regarded on an equal level with the synagogue community. So remember, at this point, the church is, we're talking about 60 to 70 AD or CE, Common Era. And so the church is, in a Roman context, is trying to assert its reliability and its integrity and its the ability for those outside to think of the church in a way that is consistent of Rome's acceptance of all ancient religions. So part of what's going on is the writer of Matthew is making a case for this Jesus movement and the gospel associated with it to be rooted in an ancient practice, that is Judaism. And that is, I think, important and instructive for the way we interpret the Gospel of Matthew. So, but whatever you think about that on that kind of background level, one of the other things that I think that we see in the Gospel of Matthew is that the writer is figuring out a way to talk about the church's identity in a way that has some kind of political code. So it's very possible that in the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, that he's actually saying, because the word is the same, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice. In fact, that makes a lot more sense to me, given what I think about the Gospel of Matthew and the Sermon on the Mount as a whole. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they will be filled. And so there is this expectation, this hope that at the end of days, as Jesus establishes this kingdom of God, that it'll be a kingdom of justice and righteousness. Echoing back to what we talked about with regard to Isaiah. There's a continuation of that hope for this messianic one, this coming one, to express justice and righteousness when it hasn't been expressed before. And I think Jesus is building some hope into his listeners to say, that justice that you want, it's going to come. And we know some things about the way Jewish leaders are participating with the Romans, and Jesus is also, I think, bringing some contradistinction in terms of the way those leaders are interacting with the Romans and are complicit with them, to saying, no, this kingdom that the book of Matthew chapter 4, prior to chapter 5, that chapter 4 brings out that Jesus comes announcing, it's going to bring with it a new, or maybe we should say a renewed emphasis on justice, that Jesus is going to set everything to rights, as New Testament theologian Tom Wright likes to say. All right, so there's a text there in Matthew, comes right out of, it seems to be fairly reliably a text, an idea that Jesus has expressed himself, and I like to think of that hungering and thirst for righteousness as a hungering and thirst for justice. So try that on, see what you think about that. I want to return to the idea of the widows and orphans for a moment as we consider a text over in the Epistle of James. By epistle, that word simply means letter. And so in the book of James that follows the book of Hebrews, James chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, we get into what a definition of real or pure religion is. James says pure religion in verse 27 of chapter 1. In other words, that which is undefiled, that is, that which is uncompromised, that which is unsoiled, is this: to visit orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. Now, we're not going to focus on the unspotted from the world part. I think that has to do with some kind of concept as it relates to sin. It might have something to do, given the rest of the book of James, with not getting too tied into an economic system. I'm still kind of processing that. But I think the other part, the care of widows and orphans, still firmly rooted in an Old Testament idea of what it means to take care of those who are weaker. And James says that's pure religion, and that is the kind of thing that is undefiled before God. It's not necessarily the kind of thing that we see in the offering of sacrifices or in the singing of worship or going to confession or in prayer. James talks about pure religion in a way of caring for others. And sometimes I think, and I've had this conversation with my son, but let me come back to that for a moment, in a moment. I kind of think that sometimes when we do our work, especially for those of us that are working with compromised or marginalized communities, or compromised people. And I think when people are sick, they're not at their best. I think they can be in really compromised situations. Those folks that are part of that healthcare team, they're right up there, up close and personal with people very often at their worst, if not the worst, at least some very bad circumstances in life. My son has an undergraduate degree in Bible and theology, and then enlisted in the Army and went to Afghanistan and toted a gun and fought. It's interesting, the conversations that Josh and I have had about what it means to give expression to religion. And he says to me, Dad, I just think, in what way, even those that might not kind of name the name of Christ, in other words, they're not part of my Christian tradition, they give their lives for the sake of their brothers in arms, isn't that in some way doing the gospel? Well, that brings in a whole lot of questions about what you think about warfare and about military action and so forth. But I think Josh has a point here, in terms of what it means to give oneself to another and to expose oneself to all of the harm that can be derived from dangerous situations. There's something about that has a certain purity to it. And again, I'm not making comments about warfare. I'm just saying why that idea of giving yourself for the sake of others seems to be consistent with what I read in the book of James. More to unpack there, but enough to think about for now.